네, 안녕하십니까.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 2021 Cities Changing Diabetes. I am Yoo Hae-in from the Novo Nordisk, Korea. Today we are gathered by many of the countries and Copenhagen including and also Seoul, and many of the experts and professionals in this field are gathered here to talk about the diabetes and inequalities. So today at this webinar, we're going to have the moderator, who is the Dr. Yoon Gun-ho, Professor of the Seoul St. Mary's Hospitals. We're also joined by Professor David Neiper and also Professor Moon Jun-sung. And also from Copenhagen, we are joined by Miss Charlotte Gloomer and also Professor Kim Shin-gun from the Korea University. And we're very thankful that you're all joining us despite your busy schedules. So first and foremost, before we get started to the webinar, let's talk about the 2021 Cities Changing Diabetes, and the welcoming remarks for this will be the first. And for that, we have the welcoming remarks by Danish Minister of Health.
To all in Seoul, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this important occasion. And I'm happy that we could arrange this webinar. It is more important than ever that you keep up the good work on preventing diabetes in our cities. The world is currently facing a severe pandemic, changing our daily lives very much. And in these times, we must not forget the issue of inequality in healthcare, which has increased. And I'm pleased that diabetes and inequality will be addressed today. Denmark and Korea have a common challenge. Our populations are aging, yours even more. Although this is positive, a challenge related to aging is that more people are developing a chronic condition. In Denmark, approximately 1 out of 3 has a long-term disease. And from a Danish point of view, chronic diseases management, including diabetes, should be inclusive. They must range from disease prevention among all citizens to care for the individual patient. With regards to care for the patients, it is important to improve the cooperation between the primary healthcare sector, the general practitioners, and the hospitals. We have a strong foundation for our collaboration with Korea, and the Danish government places great importance on the strategic partnership agreement which we signed earlier this year. And I'm pleased that Korea's Minister of Health and Welfare, Mr. Kwon, and I have agreed on an upgraded collaboration agreement, a memorandum of understanding, which includes collaboration on chronic diseases. The Cities Changing Diabetes initiative is a great example of collaboration between our two countries, and I congratulate Novo Nordisk and their partners on continuing the work in Seoul, Busan, and Daegu to prevent diabetes. Thank you.
네,
So next, we'll also have the welcome remarks from Denmark, Mr. Lars Fruergaard Jørgensen, the CEO of Novo
Your
Nordisk.
Excellencies, colleagues in public health, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to join you from Copenhagen, Denmark, for this inspiring webinar for Cities Changing Diabetes Seoul. My name is Lars Fruergaard Jørgensen, and I'm the CEO of Novo Nordisk, Denmark's largest life science company and the world's largest producer of insulin. Diabetes is a rapidly growing societal challenge worldwide, and cities are at the forefront of this challenge. They are home of more than a half of the world's population, and 2/3 of people with diabetes live in cities. The Cities Changing Diabetes initiative has set out to not only address the complications associated with diabetes, but also to prevent the onset of the condition altogether. The ambition of everyone in this program is to bend the curve on diabetes and thereby to slow down the rise. Today, more than 40 major cities home to more than 230 million people, have committed to address the societal and cultural factors that can increase the diabetes vulnerability among people living in urban environments. These cities are part of an expanding network with many more cities willing to join, and I'm really happy to have Seoul as a committed member. The recent rule of half research conducted in Seoul shows that there are still serious challenges in addressing diabetes vulnerability in the city. Prevalence of 10% is high, and only 63% of people with diabetes are diagnosed. While 94% of them receive treatment, only 23% of these citizens are in control of their HbA1c below 6.5%. This leaves many unmet needs for the citizens of Seoul. Diabetes is a complex disease. The increasing prevalence of type 2 diabetes is associated with a number of risk factors. Today, the largest modifiable risk factor, overweight and obesity, accounts for 44% of the total diabetes burden. Inactive lifestyles, insufficient physical activity, and a higher consumption of unhealthy foods are fueling the pandemic of diabetes and obesity. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the devastating effects of health inequalities and increased vulnerability. People living with pre-existing conditions such as diabetes and obesity are more likely to be hospitalized and die from COVID-19. By better understanding the status of these vulnerable populations and developing targeted solutions, we can help drive systemic change to address diabetes. Thereby, we can contribute to the future resilience of healthcare systems with a response that is integrated in all aspects of city life and builds on health in all policies. I personally believe that the Cities Changing Diabetes initiative is a truly sustainable and aspirational platform that can help bend the curve and drive the change we want to see. I wish all participants today a fruitful discussion. I hope that the insights shared at this webinar will create lasting value and knowledge to all stakeholders and help drive preventive actions to address diabetes and obesity. On behalf of Novo Nordisk, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the Seoul Metropolitan Government, the Cities Changing Diabetes Seoul Committee, the Korean Diabetes Society members, the Danish Embassy in Korea, including the Danish Ministry of Health, and of course, all of you joining today, representing a truly successful example of a private-public partnership. I would also like to recognize the valuable presence of our speakers, who share the most important insights today. Last but not least, please join me in thanking Professor David Napier and Professor Kwon Ho Young for their continuous commitment and leadership in the program. Thank you.
네, 멀리서 영상을
Thank you very
통해
much for sending the pre-recorded video from far distance. Thank you very much once again. Moving on, we would like to invite Professor Yoon Gon-ho from the St. Mary's Hospital. Thank you very much. Hello everyone, welcome. And I would like to say my great thanks to all of you participating. And I believe all the speakers and the participants' names are listed by the previous the speakers. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the names, but I truly do thanks. So I'm standing here in front of you, and I think it was back in 2018, 4 years back in Abu Dhabi. There was the IBF meeting, and I first heard the lecture of the Professor David Napier on CCD. So I was very impressed. It was almost as if my heart was pounding, because I realized for the first time that cities, the entire cities around the world, will have to change in order to do something better, something meaningful to the people suffering from the diabetes, not just giving them the medicines and just individual explanations and descriptions is not enough. We need to have a macro perspective, and this kind of new macro perspectives needed that was lacking, obviously. So it was very impressive. And right after the professor's lecture was over, I ran right into him and said, "Why is Korea out of this?" And he said, "Why not? Do always join us, and we're totally welcome. So that was the beginning of our relationship. And it was Seoul, Busan, and Daegu, the three cities of Korea, are participating in the CCD program, and we have embarked our journey together. So we're very ambitious, and back in 2020, just last year, I became the head of the KDA, the Korea Diabetics Association, and I was the one that we are going to be very committed and to all these resources and the commitment from the KDA. And it was only 1 month after the COVID-19 hit us. So you can see that it was a very challenging time to all of us. And we were looking for the end of the COVID-19. But anyways, we do have gathered a great deal of data, big data of the COVID-19. And we have the computer big data assessment through the big cities. And we now know, as mentioned by our CEO of Novo Nordisk, we know what's been the self-regulation rate and what's the prevalence rate and how it's different different cities and districts. So we did the analysis last year, and now we also are doing the vulnerability risk assessment. And what we need to do now is to put that into policy, and that is the situation right now. We have all the preparations ready, but we haven't been able to translate into actions, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Anyways, the findings of the research last year is pretty impressive. And today, we're talking about the inequality in the cities, and the health is critically related to the social inequality and also the economic inequality. So they're all related in many ways. So individual commitment, individual devotion isn't going to be sufficient. We need to look at it from the societal perspective. We need to see ourselves as neighbors and help one another as a whole society. Now, that has been the thinking for me for a long time. So we have two topics, and one is that and during this COVID-19 environment, what kind of impact has had on us, and how did the pandemic impacted us? Patients, we're going to compare the cases of Korea and also Denmark and hear from one another's experiences. And the other thing is also, of course, Professor David and also Professor Kim Shin-gon of Korea. And these two professors are going to shed us a light on what kind of researches have done on the COVID-19. In fact, Professor Kim has looked at specific cases of the Eunpyeong district and how we are isolated in many of the ways because of the lockdown and similar measures, and how the cares are, what kind of cares are needed for these people, and how the mobile apps can help. We've actually embarked on this mobile app initiative, so we're going to hear about how that has worked out by Professor Kim. Again, we are not able to meet physically, but we want to remind ourselves that we are still working in different aspects and areas of the society. So with that, I hope you all stay healthy despite these difficulties, and happy early New Year, and also Merry Christmas to all of you. So that's my wishes to all of you. And as a gift for the Christmas, we do have these beautiful lectures for you. So do enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind words. And last but not least, we'd also like to invite Mr. Rana Zafar, the country manager of Novo Nordisk Pharma Korea.
My name is Rana Azfar. I'm the General Manager for Novo Nordisk Korea. I'm here to thank everyone who has made this occasion possible. I'm special thanks to the Danish Health Minister, our CEO Lars F., and the Chairman of Changing Diabetes in Korea. I am also thankful to everybody who is looking at us from London, from maybe Dubai, and Copenhagen. And last but not the least, there's a lot of efforts from the Danish Embassy in Korea and also the Seoul Metropolitan Government. I am thankful to all of you. Without your efforts, it might not be possible to have these seminars. During the last 2 years, this pandemic has many impacts, but many learnings also. It has showed us how to do these meetings online, where speakers are sitting at different locations and we are here, but we are having this productive session. But at the same time, it has a significant impact on the diabetes. COVID and diabetes and what we have learned out of it, I think honorable speakers are going to shed light on these things. How these diseases or pandemics are impacting the prevalence of diabetes and treatment of diabetes and on the diabetic patients. This is very important to understand and implement. This city changing diabetes has conducted many research also, and then out of the research, I think the results will be presented. But as Professor Chung Ho said, that we are a bit far from implementing all those things because of this pandemic. But I'm sure with this commitment and everybody's teamwork, we are going to implement these things, and then we will pursue the Korean government and ministry to work together to make people living with diabetes stay a healthy life. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.
네, 좋으신 말씀 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for that.
이제 본격적인
Now
주제
we're going
발표를
to get into the presentation from our speakers.
시작하겠습니다.
Let us invite the first speaker.
창시자 또는
That is the father, basically, of the CCD from London. He has spared a greatly precious time with us, and that is Professor Davis Napier, from the who is a medical anthropologist of the University College London. He's going to talk about the diabetes and the inequality problems of the London and other major cities. Professor, can you hear us?
I can. Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Napier. I'm the Global Academic Lead of Cities Changing Diabetes. And I'm here to talk to you today about the relationship between COVID-19 and diabetes. And in particular, I'd like to thank Cities Changing Diabetes Seoul for this invitation. I'd like to thank the Korean Diabetes Association and especially Professor Yoon Kun Ho, who's very kindly invited me to be with you and to present today. So let me load my slides and I will begin. You can't see my slides, can you? Sorry, having a bit of problem here with my screen. There we go. So I'm going to talk today about diabetes and inequality, lessons from COVID-19. As we all know, when we look, as it were, upstream from COVID-19 in the direction of diabetes and obesity, there's a significant relationship between these two challenges. People living with diabetes and obesity are very much prone to COVID-19, and indeed, nearly half, that is to say 48% of all deaths from COVID-19 in intensive care involve obesity, and as well, a third roughly of people living with diabetes who die from COVID-19 in hospital are challenged with this disease. So the relationship between diabetes, obesity, and COVID-19 has been very, very significant. So what we have to realize then is not only do a third of hospital deaths from COVID-19 involve diabetes, but COVID-19 itself can produce alterations in glucose metabolism that enhances diabetes pathophysiology for survivors and can lead to new mechanisms provoking early onset of the disease. Now, what does this tell us? What does this mean? Well, first of all, it means that not only are diabetes and obesity major drivers of mortality and morbidity in COVID-19, but the virus itself may catalyze among survivors early onset of diabetes, modifying glucose metabolism, possibly enhancing mortality and morbidity to a future coronavirus epidemic. In our research, we call this a syndemic relationship. That is to say, where one epidemic is compounding the effects of another. if a third of all hospital deaths from COVID-19 involve diabetes, and 3/4 of all ICU submissions involve obesity, and half of the deaths in ICUs, intensive care units, involve obesity. And if COVID-19 itself produces alterations in glucose metabolism, how do we understand and address the ongoing possibility of this challenge for diabetes, prediabetes, and obese populations in infectious disease outbreaks? Or to put it another way, what might COVID-19 and all of its variants have looked like? What would their impact have been in terms of mortality and morbidity if we could remove diabetes and obesity from the equation? In other words, we see diabetes and obesity as sitting right at the center of the incredible impact that this pandemic has had. As many of you know, Cities Changing Diabetes began in 2014 as a partnership relationship between Novo Nordisk, as we heard from Lars Jorgensen, the CEO, with University College London and with the Steno Diabetes Center. And currently we have, actually this says 40 partners, but actually I think we're now up to 42 partners in the program, representing a significant population worldwide. And so we're really delighted to be able to think about what the potential might be for us to address these challenges together and collectively. So the key syndemic questions as they relate to COVID-19 and diabetes and obesity is, how do we break this cycle and disrupt this relationship? And in particular, how do we better understand and address the ongoing challenges of diabetes, prediabetes, and obesity to reduce coronavirus vulnerability? How do we understand diabetes vulnerability in terms of real-world evidence? How do we scale that evidence? How do we bring that lived experience, as we say, to the level of evidence? And then finally, as Professor Kun-Ho Yoon said, how do we alert policymakers about the need to support research around these syndemic relationships and indeed to have an impact on the illness experiences of people in the real world? Well, of course, one way that we do that is through media and public awareness. This is from the Institute for Public Policy Research in London. And of course, the press has an enormous impact on public opinion as it relates to understanding diabetes. And when the Institute for Public Policy published their data, they referred specifically to one of our Cities Changing Diabetes members in Mexico. And what I'd like to do here is talk about, therefore, in the few minutes that I have, our lesson 2, which is the health promotion challenges. And I want to use a few examples from Cities Changing Diabetes from around the world, not just London, as I've just mentioned, but the fact that the IPPR pointed to what was happening in Mexico and the impact of the soda tax in particular on Mexican public health shifts from disease prevention to health promotion. And it's arguing on the basis of sound data about vulnerability to diabetes and obesity, which were gathered by our Cities Changing Diabetes colleagues in Mexico. And indeed, we've seen really interesting results from this. As you see from this graph, what's interesting about this is after the tax was the soda tax was implemented, you see a sharp decline. You see a sharp decline in the use of sugar-sweetened beverages. But what we think is even more interesting here is that you see a sharp rise. That's the lower line on this graph in the use of water. That is the use of drinking water. So here's a real policy level change that we're really excited about, and we applaud our colleagues in Mexico City for moving this forward. This is based on some very sound research carried out by them, and also publications like this that link socioeconomic inequalities, which Professor Kun-Ho referred to, and type 2 diabetes through obesity and lifestyle factors among Mexican adults. Now, what this tells us in terms of lifestyle factors is what we really have to think in different ways about diabetes and obesity. And in particular, we need to think about what happens in people's lives. To do that, it's useful to use this simple diagram. When you think about the fact that we spend somewhere like 8,700 hours a year, only about 6 of them on average in a doctor's office. That means that the rest of the time, most of the time, is not in a healthcare setting. So what this tells us is that health is either made or lost outside of the health sector. And this is where, as Lars Jorgensen referred to, where the health and all policies agenda becomes quite important. What our colleagues in Rome, my next example, have done is that they've actually taken this very seriously. They've instituted a health and all policies approach, and indeed have come up with a curriculum called the Health City Manager Program, which actually in 6 cities currently in Italy sets aside a special person, that is to say, a special profession that actually looks at what is known in these various policy sectors: transportation, the environment, food production, so on and so forth, and tries to understand what's known locally about them and their impact on diabetes. This is led by our endocrinologist colleague, Professor Andrea Lenzi at Sapienza University in Rome. And indeed, this has resulted, as I mentioned, in an actual curriculum, a training curriculum that actually moves the health and all policies agenda into action in these cities. So we're really excited to follow on with this and to see how this emerges, because it's really a concrete change that's been implemented by Cities Changing Diabetes in Italy. Whereas if you look at our colleagues in China, what we find is that there's tremendously good hospital-based diabetes data, but the real-world data is something that we've had to go out and discover. And indeed, in doing that, we've made what we think are some quite very interesting observations. Now, we know what the social determinants of health are around education, access and quality healthcare, neighborhoods and built environments, so on and so forth, and economic stability. But what the research there demonstrated, which we think is really interesting, is that it's not only these social determinants, but some very strong sociocultural drivers that actually impact diabetes. And in particular, things like trust or mistrust in healthcare delivery, isolation, social isolation being really important. And of course, having enough time, what we call time poverty, that is to say, having the agency to be able to affect change in your life, so that diabetes and obesity aren't 8th or 9th on your list, they're number 1 or number 2. At the level of isolation, we found this really quite stunning observation that they were able to make based upon the Cities Changing Diabetes research, that when people were asked about living with diabetes about how important lack of community support or friends or family support, that is to say, these are proxies for equality and that is to say, proxies for isolation. We found that actually people stunningly said that this was over 90% of people reported this to be critical. Whereas when we asked about equality specifically, that is to say, things like low income, unemployment, and medical insurance, that was a third. Which is to say that in their research, they found that actually isolation was almost 3 times as much a driver of people's inability to manage their diabetes. And they've reported these findings, and we're really eager to see how this new sociocultural perspective emerges in policy decisions. So finally, I'm not going to say much about Copenhagen, because Charlotte Gloomer will be telling you about that, but I can't finish my brief talk without celebrating how in Copenhagen this difference between equality and equity has manifested itself. Thinking about a country which is the gold standard worldwide in terms of healthcare delivery, to think about how in such a place with a national diabetes rate of somewhere just over 8.8% or 8.3%, that if you control for, as you see in this graph, for employed people with higher education of Northern European descent, that rate actually drops to 2.1%. But if you look at migrant populations who don't have a higher education, that rate is almost 9 times higher in a country that could be taken to be the most equal in the world. And we're really thrilled that our colleagues in Copenhagen have come up with some super interesting initiatives to try to address this. And I'm certainly not going to take the wind out of Charlotte's sails, so I'm not going to say more about that. Leave it to her. But just finally, to end by saying that we're really, really thrilled that the kind of work that we're doing is now having impact at other levels. For example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation recently published. We were part of that, part of this policy brief around the cultural context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we came up with these quite specific policy recommendations that policymakers need to account for the sociocultural understanding of disease, that leaders need to have strategies to mobilize their efforts to support public health, that health authorities need to be actively engaged with communities in building social trust, and that health authorities need to recognize the long-term impacts of not actually attending to these things, and to identify the factors locally, as Professor Yoon Kun-ho said, the local drivers that shape vulnerability and resilience. So with that, I'd just like to say it's a tremendous honor to be with you here, if remotely, and I wish you all the best of luck. And I'm really looking forward to the other speakers and to seeing you again in person sometime soon. Thank you very much.
네, 좋으신 말씀 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And then now, moving on, we have Professor Jun Sung Moon talking about diabetes and COVID-19 in Korea. He has actually provided a pre-recorded video for the presentation, and then afterwards we'll greet him personally during the discussion.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Chairman. I'm Jun Sung Moon from Yeongnam University, Daegu, Korea, and it is my great honor to have my presentation in this meeting. Today, I'd like to talk about the connection between COVID-19 and diabetes and our recent experiences. It has been around 2 years after hearing the breaking bad news from Wuhan, China, and we are still living in the COVID-19 pandemic situation. This graphic shows the trend comparison of SARS-CoV-2 confirmed cases between Danish and the Republic of Korea. In both countries, the number of confirmed cases is rapidly increasing due to the emergence of new variants of SARS-CoV-2 virus. This is a mortality trend, and interestingly, the incidence of Denmark is 9 times higher than that of Korea, but the mortality rate is similar in both countries. Anyway, it is well known that infectious diseases are more frequent and serious in patients with diabetes. Chronic hypoglycemia is associated with reduced response of T lymphocytes, neutrophil function, and disorders of humoral immunity. Therefore, diabetes increases the susceptibility to infections. Clinical studies also have been suggested that the diabetic patients have a higher risk of respiratory infections, such as bacterial pneumonia and tuberculosis. And diabetes has been found the risk factor of the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, from 2015. This meta-analysis showed that diabetes significantly increased by 80% of the death risk in MERS patients. Therefore, we can easily speculate that diabetes and hypoglycemia would be associated with the severity and mortality of COVID-19. Currently, diabetes is well established as one of the common comorbidity of COVID-19 patients worldwide. Even though the COVID-19 prevalence has been reported variably according to each country's policies or strategies, but the portion of diabetes generally reported around 20%. This slide shows a recent meta-analysis about the association between diabetes and COVID-19 severity, and 76 studies involving 31,000 patients with COVID-19 were included. As you can see, COVID-19 patients with diabetes were at significantly elevated risk of a severe infection and mortality, around 2 times higher. So collectively, we can say diabetes increases the severity and mortality in patients with COVID-19, and clinicians should pay more attention to the monitoring and treatment of patients having both COVID-19 and diabetes. Meanwhile, I would like to introduce our experience. Daegu, which located in southeast part of Korea Peninsula, is the third largest city in Korea. February 2020, last year, the first large outbreak of COVID-19 outside China happened in our city, Daegu. The outbreak crisis started on the last year, February 18, and peaked on after 10 days with over 700 new cases confirmed in a day. This is not strange in these days, but at that time we are on panic. So this crisis was caused by some kind of the Sincheonji Daegu church worship events. And this cartoon shows the distribution of the confirmed cases at that time from the January to the May 2020. And you can see the Daegu is the very high number of the confirmed cases. After starting the massive outbreak, we sequentially experienced one fatal diabetic ketoacidosis and another smaller hypoglycemic state case, and reported in the DMJ, the official journal of KDA. And it was the first case report of acute hypoglycemia crisis associated with COVID-19 in Korea. My colleagues and I took care of COVID-19 patients at that time, and we recognized that the diabetes was closely associated with the clinical outcomes of COVID-19. So we reviewed and analyzed medical records and published early experience of our center. It was also the first study about the association between diabetes and COVID-19 in Korea. In this study, diabetes increases the risk of composite outcomes of ARDS, septic shock, ICU care, and mortality by 10 times after adjusting confounding factors. Even though the limitation with a single center study, but this result was consistent with earlier clinical reports from China. There are 5 tertiary hospitals in our city, and these hospitals have taken care of severe SARS-CoV patients during disaster situations. Diabetes specialists in our region conducted a retrospective multi-center observational study, and we compared the effect of diabetes on mortality using propensity score matching. As you expected, the presence of diabetes increased the risk of mortality by 2.4 times compared to non-diabetic population, adjusting relevant clinical risk factors. In particular, the bad news was only seen in people over 70 years old, not under 70 years old, and the risk was greater. This is a nomogram for predicting the mortality risk of corona patients in Korea, and it was developed based on the data mainly provided from our city. You can identify that diabetes is important comorbidity with cancer and dementia in Korea. Anyway, it is consistently confirmed that diabetes leads to poor outcomes in COVID-19 from another huge data set. OpenSafely is the secure health analytics platform that covers 40% of all patients in England, and diabetes and obesity were also revealed crucial detrimental effects on COVID-19 outcomes in England. Why does diabetes have the bad impact on COVID-19? It is hard to say that right answer exactly, but interestingly, both diseases share common pathophysiologies such as hypercoagulability, endothelial dysfunction, and fibrosis. So we can easily speculate that coexistence of these two stigmas resulting in more mortality. This cartoon clearly shows that how diabetes and hyperglycemia are linked with the poor outcomes in SARS-CoV-2 infection. Make a long story short, SARS-CoV-2 infection triggers several inflammatory pathways, and diabetes aggravates this course and finally leads to cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. When SARS-CoV-2 invades cells, it requires a kind of gate in the cell membrane that is called ACE2. So ACE2 expression is important for susceptibility to COVID-19. Increased ACE2 expression in metabolic disease patients has been suggested as one of the reasons explaining their poor COVID prognosis. This study showed they used the surgical liver samples, and they showed ACE2 expression levels are different by sex, the presence of the diabetes, and insulin resistance markers. So the ACE2 mRNA expression is much higher in diabetes than those without diabetes, and positively correlate with home IR. So we can refer to it indirectly why diabetes is a risk factor for COVID-19 patients. In addition, hyperglycemia promotes cytokine storm by monocyte dysregulation. This study suggested that elevated glucose and glycolysis promote SARS-CoV-2 replication and cytokine production through aberrant monocyte response, and finally resulting T cell dysfunction and epithelial cell death. Furthermore, many researchers have tried to find meaningful risk factors, and the quantity of visceral fat is one of the candidates. Here you can see the two patients who were contracting COVID-19, but the upper younger patient, he was only 27 years old, had both lung haziness compared to 51-year-old patient located below. The chest was very clear. And what factors bring this different outcome? They found that the visceral fat area was higher in patients with poor outcome. A cross-section pilot study from Germany found visceral fat area assessed by CCD was higher in ICU and mechanical ventilator rather than those in the normal ward. Whereas BMI was not different among the groups. After adjusting age and sex, an increase in visceral fat area by 10 centimeters square was associated with a 1.3 times higher likelihood of both ICU and mechanical ventilation. Coincidentally, similar results were also published in from Italy, where also visceral adipose tissue was independently associated with the need for intensive care. As you can see, the visceral adipose tissue area is highly correlated with the poor outcomes. These findings might be explained by a close relationship between adipose tissue inflammation and coagulopathy. When compared to subcutaneous adipose tissue, visceral fat is closely related to inflammatory cytokines production in obesity, and these mediators result in hypercoagulability. SARS-CoV-2 infection also exacerbate the inflammation and increase the risk of coagulopathy. So overlapping of obesity and COVID-19 will make the worst situations. Let's move on to the next part. As we discussed earlier, diabetes tends to have a bad COVID-19 prognosis, but not always. In patients with diabetes, which patients will have poor outcomes? The Coronado study, which was taken in France, was shown some critical insights for this question. The Coronado study included 53 sites in France and initially 1,300 patients with COVID-19 and diabetes. And the primary outcome was a 7-day mortality or invasive mechanical ventilation. So in this study, surprisingly, A1C level was not associated with the severity. In the Coronado study, the BMI prior to admission and dyspnea, lymphocyte count, AST, and CRP on admission were surrogates for predicting death or mechanical ventilation day 7. And age was associated with the death, and the GFR, AST, and the platelet level on admission predicted the short-term mortality. Recently, Coronado Group published the updated result, and they revealed that history of the microvascular complications, anticoagulant therapy, dyspnea on admission, and higher AST, WBC, and CRP levels were associated with a reduced chance of discharge. Actually, this result was consistent with our earlier reports. When we analyzed the patients who admitted our hospital, old age was associated with the severe and critical outcomes, but not HbA1c. However, higher glucose levels seem to closely related to COVID-19 mortality in diabetes. In the multicenter study from Wuhan, China, investigators divided into two groups according to glucose level and compared between groups which above and below 180 milligram per deciliter. The mortality risk significantly decreased by 9% in well-controlled group compared with the poorly controlled group. In this context, there was a previous report that the fasting blood glucose was correlated with prognosis in SARS patients. Given this insight, we also analyzed whether the fasting glucose level could predict the in-hospital mortality or not. Interestingly, as in previous studies, high fasting glucose levels also significantly predicted mortality in COVID-19, regardless of a known history of diabetes. Now, similar to our report, another study confirmed the importance of fasting blood glucose in COVID-19 patients. Two Chinese hospitals recruited patients without diabetes, and fasting glucose level at admission is still an independent predictor for 28-day mortality and complications. These results suggest intensive monitoring should be required to COVID-19 patients, even where they have no pre-existing diabetes. And NAFLD or NASH are emerging risk factors for cardiovascular disease and even hepatocellular carcinoma. And the degree of fibrosis is clinically important in poor progress rather than simple steatosis. For assessing the fibrosis, several non-invasive methods has been in the spotlight because it is difficult to obtain the biopsy tissue from all suspected patients. So among them, fibrosis-4 is widely used as a surrogate marker to evaluate the fibrosis, and we wanted to investigate whether FIB4 is related to the prognosis of COVID-19 in diabetic patients. And me and my colleagues and I found that high FIB4 group have a significantly higher mortality risk, and diabetes and high FIB4 has synergistic impact on mortality risk. As you can see here, the high FIB4 and the diabetes group has over 9.5 times higher mortality risk compared to non-diabetic and low FIB4 groups. And interestingly, if FIB4 is low, even the diabetic patients show a similar risk with the non-diabetic group. And we also analyzed another outcomes such as duration of PCR test negative conversion length and the hospital stay. Interesting things are that the length of hospital stay was longest in diabetes and the high FIB4 group, but PCR negative conversion duration was no different among groups. These results suggest that in addition to diabetes, FIB4 is a risk factor that can be considered for predicting the prognosis of COVID-19 patients. Before closing my talk, I should touch the vaccination issue. As we know, based on the tons of evidence, government recommends people with diabetes have priority on COVID-19 vaccination. The vaccination itself produces forced immune reactions in the body. So reactive hypoglycemia is also easily found in clinical practice. So intensive monitoring is required more often than usual for several days. And if not controlled, the patients have to educate it, they should visit a clinic or hospital. Even though the clinical evidence is limited, the antibody response of people with diabetes after vaccination might not be different compared with the general population. This is my last slide. Diabetes is reported as one of the common comorbidity and associated with poor outcomes in patients contracting COVID-19. Inadequate glycemic control is associated with poor prognosis in patients with diabetes, and vice versa also. Evidence for discriminating the patients at high risk are accumulating, such as fasting glucose level on admission or FIB-4 level. And finally, vaccination is only and timely protective way from COVID-19 currently. So we should encourage the vaccination to our patients. I would like to express my thanks to my colleagues in our city, Daegu, and thank you for your attention.
네, 좋으신 발표 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. Moving on from a different time zone, we are very pleased to have Ms. Charlotte Gloomer, Director of Center for Diabetes from Municipality of Copenhagen. She is going to shed us a light on diabetes and inequality, COVID-19 in Copenhagen. Please.
Charlotte, can you hear us?
Charlotte, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, clearly.
Yeah, I can see them now. Thank you. Thank you for being invited for having this speech today in Seoul. I hope to see you sometimes next year, maybe. But I'm a director of Center for Diabetes in Copenhagen City, and I'm going to give you a talk about how we work with inequality in health in Copenhagen, and also a little bit about our experiences during the COVID-19 in our center. It will be a more practical view of how we work on diabetes in daily life in the municipality. Just switch my slides. How do I switch? Here, next. I do have I have a little bit problems to change the slide. Here. But we have been a part of CCD since 2012, and just before we became the part of the CCD group, we made these kind of calculations that we are in Copenhagen City there lives about 600,000 people, and 5.1% of those of the adults having type 2 diabetes, and it corresponds to about 25,000 people. Furthermore, 10 to 20% are at risk of having diabetes, and we're developing this in the coming years. And lastly, we saw that 50% of the people with diabetes didn't reach their treatment target goals. So therefore, the mayor and the politicians made these kind of action plan that Napier is shown you just before, an action plan for type 2 diabetes in the Copenhagen city. It was an action plan that should focus on especially social inequality in health. The Center for Diabetes should be established, and we should work with new innovative solutions. This action plan is actually run out, and we have just we're working on a new action plan. I will show you that in just a few minutes. But we also saw in the analysis we made in 2012 that for many people, diabetes is not their top priorities. They have a lot of competing problems, that multiple diseases, they are shortly educated, they are unemployed, and they are lonely, living alone, and do not have supportive relations. So therefore, diabetes is on their number 10 of their list of problems. And this is more likely to be in the men that are more than 50 years old. So this is a group of citizens that we should take especially care of. But in the center, we started out in 2016, and I came to the city at that time as a director. And at that time, we were 16 employees. Now we are 50 employees, and we also have people with both type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. We are not doing treatment, but we're doing rehabilitation and prevention in our center. All patients are referred by the GPs or the hospitals, or some of them are also self-referrals coming from the street. It's also, you can see here the picture. We are in these two floors, second and third floor in this building. And one of our main vision is also to have partnerships with the diabetes patient association and the health and the heart patient associations. And furthermore, we have partnerships with researchers and especially Steno Diabetes Center Copenhagen, which is a hospital treating people with diabetes. But now we have just coming up with a new action plan for our center, and our strategic aim is that Copenhageners with type 2 diabetes and or cardiovascular diseases managing to their daily life and maintain physical and mental health. Our target groups are especially citizens with type 2 diabetes and or cardiovascular diseases, but we are also looking into citizens at high risk of developing the two diseases. So it will be especially citizens with pre-diabetes. At this time, we have new tracks in our action plan, and track 1 is how we collaborate across entities, especially across our units in the municipality, which we are really big city, a big municipalities with 48,000 employees. So it's sometimes very difficult to collaborate, but we should also collaborate across sectors with the hospitals and the GPs. This is track 1. Track 2 is how do we secure equity in health, both in primary prevention, but also in secondary and tertiary prevention. And track 3 is focusing on mental health, because we know that a lot of people with chronic diseases also suffer for bad mental health, as diabetes stress especially, but also anxiety and depression. And our last track is to generate and sharing knowledge. We have to be a national and international beacon in rehabilitation and primary prevention of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. So this is the plan we're working on the next 4 years. To succeed with this plan, we work with these principles. The main principle in our center, now I'm going into our center, is that we are person-centered. We work differentiated, so the people do have different kind of services in our center. I will come back to that. We really focus on physical, but also mental health. Before we mainly focused on physical health as diet, smoking, alcohol, and physical activity. But now we are really focusing on mental health. We are using active user involvement, both in the developing of new services, but also as being person-centered in the daily life in the center. And then we work on evidence, but if we do not have the evidence, we use the best knowledge or practice we have in the field, and we like to be a partner in evidence making in this area. And we cannot be a beacon if we do not collaborate with researchers and other partners in the healthcare system and civil society. So this is our principles and values. So coming to equality or equity in health, we use the person-centered approach, I said. We do have, and Napier also shown that, we do have still a social inequality in the prevalence of diabetes and especially also in the outcomes of diabetes in the Danish society, unfortunately. But therefore, when you see this slide, we work on the middle one in my center, where every people do not use the same number of boxes to see the football match on the other side of the fence. So my employees are also always talking about which kind of box do the patient need and how many boxes do the patient needs. And if you're going to the justice side, the right side of the three pictures, you can see if you it don't have a fence, but do have structures that also facilitate that the people can see the football match. It will also increase social equity in the society and also make justice. And I mean, this we work on in the entire city with building a lot of bike lanes, so it's easy to bike. We are working with the retail to make the healthy choice the easy choice in the retail supermarkets and so on. And we are working making recreational areas where it's easy to be physical active. All these will facilitate not only people with diabetes or other chronic diseases to live a healthy life, but will also facilitate all Copenhageners to take the easy choice. So, but when I'm coming into our center, reaching out different approaches to handle social inequality in health, we work especially in deprived areas where we have a huge proportion of people with short education and with another background than Danish, ethnic background than Danish. We also made a lot of different kind of physical activities, and here you can see football. Fitness is a work with a collaboration we have with the Danish Heart Association, where we are training with people with both diabetes and heart diseases, and together with the peers from these associations taking over when we not are in the group anymore. And furthermore, we have developed a peer support program where people with diabetes with a little bit more resources help people with less resources. They can, for example, go out and drink a coffee. They can go to the doctors. They can help with all that stuff that come up in the dialogue between the peers in daily life. So that's one way also to tackle the social inequality in health and in outcomes of diabetes. But in our center, we see up to 2,000 patients with type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular diseases per year. They are mainly newly diagnosed, but there are also people that have had the disease for several years and also have severe complications. And we see people with different ethnic backgrounds. Actually, 35% of our population in the center are of non-Western ethnic background, and this is actually a higher proportion of non-Western ethnic people here in the center compared to the background population. So it means that we really have contact with these people and maybe help them, and therefore also decrease, hopefully, the social inequality in complications and outcomes of diabetes. And we also see people here with a higher proportion of people with shorter educational background. When you come to the center, you start having a consultation and dialogue with one of my healthcare professionals. Here we talk into have an initial assessment of the needs, what matters to the citizen, what is the motivation and preferences of services, and then they are planning the intervention in the center, and the intervention is about 3 to 6 months. Actually, we use a special questionnaire, the patient-reported outcome questionnaire, where we can see the needs and have a talk about that in the dialogue. Under the way, when they are in our center, they have follow-up dialogues where we are just make new plans for interventions and new goals for interventions, and at the end they have a concluding consultation, and we send a letter to the GP and the hospital on what's going on in the center. The opportunities and services we have is both in group and individual based services. You can have self-management support, physical training, and diet and cooking sessions, and we have all these kind of services in different languages, primarily Danish, but also in Arab and Turkish, which are the main spoken foreign languages we have in Copenhagen. But in the self-management support education, we talk about what matters to me. How do you manage your chronic diseases? Looking into the risk factors and motivation and goal setting, also mental health and well-being, and then how we also learn the patients or the citizens how they communicate with their healthcare professionals. In physical training, we are actually at the moment primarily outdoor because of the COVID-19, but we both have indoor and outdoor training sessions. We do have, and when we are outdoor, we use actively the facilities in the cities, so the citizens can see how they use these facilities. We have both fitness and ball games. We have mental health training as yoga and meditation in recreational areas. And we work hardly on building up relations and networking between the citizens so they can train afterwards together without having our trainers in the room. And we have building up a 12-11 network that's which going on now, and taking in new citizens every month when they're stopping in our centers. Our cooking and diet sessions are both individual consultations, but it's also practical cooking sessions where they learn practical skills and have learned about healthier alternatives. But when we have the cooking sessions, we're also working on the socializing, making food. So you can see we have a lot of different kind of services, and these services, they are just developed together with the citizens. So we have also finally I would say, before I go to the COVID-19, I will just briefly talk about that we have made an outcome survey, an outcome study from our center, and the main result we have seen is that we have increased with a 35% increase in certainty to tackle diabetes. We increased it from 55% from the start of from start, and 70 to follow up. We saw when we at baseline that about 40% of the people having diabetes de-stress when they started. We decreased it by 42% to 22%. So there's still something to do in this area. We decreased the mean BMI, and a very important result is that we also decreases the HbA1c with 6.1 millimolar per mole. So it decreased from 57.5 to 51.4 millimolar per mole at baseline to the end of our study. And this is a really important result because it shows us that we also have effect on a kind of a hard core effect on this kind of initiative. And I think the effect of HbA1c is mostly because they are more physical active. They eat. They have a little decrease in BMI, but they also started to taking the medicine. Maybe this is the most important finding, that they can see why they should take the medicine, and that we have a higher compliance in taking medicine after being in our center. So then I just briefly will talk about COVID-19, because here we disrupted when we locked down in March 2020. We had an urgent need to ensure the citizens with type 2 diabetes stayed active and maintained the level of services we have, although they couldn't come into our center. We should stay home. So all citizens were contacted by telephone more than once. We did new procedures on how to handle new referrals by telephone or by Teams. We have an extreme quick developing on process to adapt the existing teaching program materials to the virtual platform, from idea to going live in less than 1 month. We had all citizens in Teams having these educational sessions. We have been making training links and movies produced on the website, and we make also cooking movies with easy recipes, which we also put on the website. And here you can see how we have this virtual education program, which with 4 modules. We talk about what is diabetes, a little bit about diabetes, training and self-management. And here it's really difficult to be in a dialogue and reflection, but we try to make a mix between knowledge and reflection and action planning on these teams. But it's more difficult to be in dialogue and do reflections with the citizens. But it works. And here you can see our update on the website where we made these kind of videos. And the lesson we learned was that we really talked about how we communicate key messages on Teams, especially when we can't see the people on the screen. But we also virtual platforms are really great to share knowledge, but it's harder to generate dialogue and discussion among the participants, especially. We did compress the sessions. We need to have a flexible setup in our center, especially we start new classes every week. If it's needed, then it's easy to scale up when you have these kind of sessions. You do need to have, especially here in the beginning, when we were not used to use Teams, both the healthcare professionals were not used to it, and the citizens at all was not used to it. But therefore we are 2 healthcare professionals in the teaching sessions. So one is handling all the technical issues and is a wingman under the teaching session. But what we learned was that we did see, or still do see, new groups of people who attended these kind of classes. Some of are attending during lunch break when they are at work. We also saw a great potential in tackling social inequality, especially people with anxiety and depression. They think it's easier to be in this class because they can just hide behind the screen, but they get some. They gain some things and learn some things how to handle their diseases being behind the screen. So it's really impressive to work on this kind of services and initiatives, and we would not have done this in that speed if the COVID-19 was not coming to our city or to the world in 2020. But so I mean, this is a positive effect of the COVID-19, and now we are working on it. We are open now, and we are working both virtual and in face-to-face services at the moment. So thank you very much for being a part of this important meeting.
네, 발표 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for the informative presentation. And last, Professor Shin-gon Kim from Korea University Annam Hospital, looking at the trends in socioeconomic inequalities and major risk factors for cardiovascular disease in Korea, and a pilot study by mobile application to support vulnerable patients with diabetes.
네, 잘 들립니다.
And can you see my presentation material?
네, 잘 보입니다.
Okay. Yes, thank you for your kind introduction. I'm Shin-gon Kim from Korea University College of Medicine. It is my great pleasure to be here and share Korean data for this valuable meeting. Today my topic is about the trends in socioeconomic inequality.
저 교수님, 죄송하지만 그 발표 자료가 안 보이고
So we cannot see
윈도우
your
화면이
slide. We
보이고
can only
있거든요.
see your background for the computer. So please pull up your slides.
지금 보이시나요?
네, 지금 슬라이드는 보이고요. 아직
So
전체
can
화면이
you
아니라
see my
그
slides now?
프레젠테이션 모드로
Yes, so please
나오고
start the presentation with the slides.
지금도 전체 화면이 아니에요?
네.
Even now?
잠깐만요.
아, 네, 이제 전체 화면이 아니군요.
보이시나요?
Can you see it now?
네, 지금
Yes, we
보이고
can.
있는데 아직도 전체 화면은 아니고 네, 프레젠테이션 모드에
So please click on full screen.
지금도 안 보이시나요?
Do you still?
네,
Not-
슬라이드 잘 보이고
Yes, we can
있습니다.
see the slides.
됐어요?
아, 네, 그 아직 전체 화면 아니지만 발표해 주시면 될 것 같아요.
Yes, I think that you can proceed. Yes.
김신원 쌤 오른쪽 아래 그 전체 화면 버튼 두 번 연달아 눌러야 됩니다.
So please click on the full screen icon 2 times.
그냥 하겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
I will just simply proceed.
So I'm sorry, there's some trouble. So today my talk is consist of three parts. The first part is social economic status and cardiovascular risk factor and outcome in Korea. And second part is the trend in socioeconomic inequality in Korea. And finally, I'd like to introduce some kind of intervention to decrease the socioeconomic inequality, including the Korean Diabetes Association's project. The socioeconomic status has a measurable and significant effect on cardiovascular health. So the biological, behavioral, and social risk factor prevalent in disadvantaged individuals accentuate the link between SES and CVD. And there are several markers of socioeconomic status, such as the income level and the educational attainment and employment status and environmental factor. But as you know, there are some difference between location and culture. That means that the London and Copenhagen and Seoul cities, the culture are also different. This slide shows socioeconomic status and obesity published in Korean Obesity Society. And this, the pink line indicating the proportion of the prevalence of in female, and the blue line, the blue box indicating the prevalence of male. So as you can see, this is the less than elementary school graduate. So as education level decreased, the prevalence of obesity increased, and this phenomenon is much prominent in female. This is the prevalence of obesity by household income. In all adults, especially in female, the prevalence of obesity became higher as the household income became lower. And this slide shows the changes in prevalence of diabetes in Korea in the recent 7 years. And the prevalence of diabetes was 11.8% in 2012, and nowadays is 30.8% in 2018. And this slide shows the prevalence of diabetes by family income, and the quintile 1 indicating the lowest family income. The prevalence of diabetes is higher in people with low family income, in men and women. And this is a relative combined effect of socioeconomic status and diabetes mortality. The both low socioeconomic status and diabetes are important risk factors for mortality. However, little is known about their combined effect and relative contribution to the mortality risk. So we investigated this relationship. We enrolled for the 153,000 subjects who were over 13 years of age from 2003 to 2004 and were followed up until 2010. And SAS group were categorized into 3 groups: the highest 30% as S1, and middle 40% as S2, and lowest 30% as S3. This non-DM means non-diabetes, and S1 means the high social economic status. This bar indicating the cardiovascular disease incidence rate. As you can see, in diabetic patients, the cardiovascular incidence rate is much higher, is about 2-fold. But there was no difference regardless of the socioeconomic status. But the mortality rate, cardiovascular mortality rate is different story. As you can see, the diabetic patient with the low socioeconomic status, the highest cardiovascular mortality compared to other group. And interestingly, the diabetic patient with high socioeconomic status, the mortality rate is comparable to the non-diabetic patient with middle or low socioeconomic status. The second part is the trend in socioeconomic inequality in Korea. Several years ago, we analyzed and published this data, the trends in socioeconomic inequality in 5 major cardiovascular risk factors for cardiovascular disease in Korean population. And using data from Korean National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, 2001 to 2014. The SES has shown inverse association with cardiovascular disease, and the previous study has shown the greater decline in the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factor among higher SES group and widened the gap among SES group over time in the United States. However, studies in England and Australia failed to provide a strong evidence the SES inequality in CVD risk factor has increased in a recent decade. The Korea, a recently developed country, has experienced a rapid socio-economic growth over the decade, and the gap in socio-economic circumstance has widened during this period. Therefore, it is expected the inequality in the health of Koreans is probably even greater. The purpose of this study was to examine recent national trend in SS inequality in 5 major CVD risk factors such as smoking, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and hypercholesterolemia, using national survey data by gender. A total of 42,000 Koreans aged 25 to 64 years. And also the main outcome measure was trend in SE inequality in 5 major CVD risk factors. The education level and income were used as SES indicator. Education level were grouped into 4 groups. College were the higher and the elementary school were less. And measure of income was equalized gross household income per month. We divided study subject into 4 groups according to quartile of equalized household income by gender and age. And statistical analysis to measure socioeconomic health inequality, we used the relative index of inequality, RRI, to permit meaningful comparison of socioeconomic health inequality over a survey period. And RRI enables the direct comparison between SES variables with regard to the proportion of a population in different categories. So as a result, the gender difference was noted in the time trend in SES inequality in smoking, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. Among men, low socioeconomic status was associated with high prevalence of smoking, but the magnitude of socioeconomic inequality in the smoking, obesity, and diabetes remained unchanged, and the magnitude of the inequality of hypertension even decreased over time. However, among women, low socioeconomic status was associated with higher prevalence of the smoking, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, and also time trend toward increasing socioeconomic inequality measured by income in smoking, obesity, diabetes were found in women. Recently, we updated this data. We expanded this data to the KNS, as a result of 59,000 participants and KNS 2001 to 2018 in order for this analysis. The blue line indicating the decreasing trend, and the red color indicating the increasing trend. So as you can see, in male, the prevalence of smoking showed the decreasing trend. However, the prevalence of obesity, abdominal obesity, and hypercholesterolemia show the increasing trend in male. In female, the prevalence of smoking, the increasing trend, and also the prevalence of hypercholesterolemia show the increasing trend. On the other hand, the prevalence of obesity and prevalence of abdominal obesity and prevalence of hypertension show the decreasing trend. But the analysis according to the BMI level, even in female, the prevalence of obesity decreased pattern. However, the obesity defined by BMI more than 30 and BMI more than 35, the prevalence of obesity showed an increasing pattern in female. And this is the prevalence of obesity in women according to age group. The younger age group between 18 to 40 years, the prevalence of obesity significantly increased during the study period compared to the decreasing pattern in overall population. In male, the socioeconomic inequality usually stable during the study period. So we focused on age-adjusted odds ratio and the relative inequality index, just focused on female. In terms of smoking, the significantly increasing trend in educational inequality with regard to smoking prevalence was noted among the women. This is a low social economic status indicated by the pink line and the blue line indicating high social economic status. And this is the obesity indicator. The time trend toward the increasing inequality in obesity measured by income level was noted in women during the study period. However, the time trend in inequality in obesity was stable among men. This is a central obesity. So in women, time trend toward the increasing inequality in central obesity by education and income level were noted in women during the study period. And this is a diabetes trend. Time trend in inequality in diabetes was stable among men. However, time trend toward the increasing inequality in diabetes by income level was noted in women during the study period. This is focused on hypertension trend. The time trend toward the increasing inequality in hypertension by education level was noted in women during the study period, but there is no difference among men. So this is a summary of a trend. The trend in prevalence of cardiovascular risk factor during the study period, as you can see, the prevalence of smoking a decreasing pattern, but the obesity measure and prevalence of hypercholesterolemia show the increased pattern in male. And in female, the prevalence of smoking and prevalence of hypercholesterolemia showed the increasing pattern. However, the prevalence of obesity measure and prevalence of the hypertension showed the decreasing pattern. But interestingly, some different story in terms of trends in SES inequality during the study period. As you can see, there was no difference in terms of SES inequality during the study period. Exceptional case, just central obesity. However, in women, the prevalence of smoking and obesity, central obesity, diabetes, and hypertension was the SES inequality as it widened during the study period. And finally, I'd like to introduce some intervention to decrease socioeconomic inequality. Low social economic status characterized by some poor access to care and healthy food and related several factors, including psychosocial and behavioral and environmental factors. So we need more intervention, such as behavioral counseling and community-based program and health education or local and federal health policy. As previous speaker explained properly, there is a significant relationship between COVID-19 and disparity in common non-communicable disease, such as diabetes. This is the interesting trial, the tailored cognitive behavioral therapy, so-called CBT, focused in diabetic patients with depressive and regimen-related distress symptoms. This randomized control trial included 139 diverse rural adults with type 2 diabetes and comparison of 16 the session severity tailored CBT. This is a very costly and intensive the intervention by psychosocial expert and compared with usual care and primary outcome change in A1C and depressive symptom and self-care behavior and adherence. So after completion of the intervention, in intervention arm showed the improved their depression score and self-care activity score and medication adherence score. Even in there is a small difference in metabolic parameters such as A1C. But this kind of the cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, as I told, very intensive and costly approaches. So alternative approaches needed, so-called the universal health coverage, such as behavioral activation, BA. The BA is a simpler psychological treatment than CBT and can be delivered by junior mental health worker with a less intensive, less costly training and with low less effect than CBT. So this kind of the behavioral activation, so focused on process of behavioral activation, negative cycle and positive cycle. So we recommend some kind of a scheduling and plausible meaning activity for individuals and daily based monitoring, mood and action, and individual setting goal, and as a result, overcoming barrier and additional skill training. So Korean Diabetes Association nowadays initiated this kind of IT support for Korean with low social economic status. This is a smartphone application to help community dwelling and diabetic patients with a low socioeconomic position, and psychosocial support through the application, and if needed, offline counseling is possible. And holistic care targeting both the psychological and physical status, and the intervention setting is a public-private partnership. So we call in Korean word 당당 care. 당당 means the diabetic patient with dignity, regardless of their social economic status. This 당당 care characterized by 3 points. One is application-based psychological support, digital care, and complementary visiting home care provided by the public sector, the smart care, and community-based solution, so community care. So personalized Medicare for community dwelling diabetic patient in low socioeconomic position. This is some kind of avatar by individual patient, the baby doctor, after input by individuals that can grow the mature turtle. The first mobile, the application for psychological counseling and support for individuals suffering from difficulty in managing diabetes owing to social, psychological, and economical burden in South Korea. So we developed in collaboration with clinical psychologists based on the behavioral activation program, BA program. And this program consists of a step-by-step guide to personalized diabetes care for 12 weeks. The 7th step of the BA program in 당당 care, step 1, education, diabetes distress and behavioral activation. Step 2, identifying and exploring daily activity. And step 3, planning value-centered activity. Step 4, reviewing action plan and activity. And step 5, problem solving, avoidance and rumination. And step 6, habituation of behavioral activation. And step 7, the prevention of recurrence of termination. We daily the check and feedback based on the mood diary. This is the public-private partnership. We are nowadays collaborating with Eunpyeonggu and Seochogu in Seoul City. So this is the study design of the 당당 care, the feasibility of intervention with a mobile application based on the behavioral activation program. We randomly assigned 2 groups. One group is mobile application, and the other group is usual care. The aim of this study was to investigate the effect of 당당 care on the improvement of psychological problem and diabetes self-management. The outcome consists of 3 parts. The first part is a change in psychological problem. The second is changes in diabetes self-management. And finally, changes in glycemic control and lipid profile. So we enrolled the 62 participants and planning to recruit 124 individuals, assuming the 40% of dropout rate, because these individuals with the low social economic status. So we assume the high the dropout rate. And key inclusion criteria: adult aged 30 to 70 years with type 2 diabetes, and these are the advanced population, and mild to moderate depressive symptom, and able to read and understand Korean and use a mobile application. Key exclusion criteria is severe depressive symptoms. In conclusion, the socioeconomic status had a stronger impact on major cardiovascular risk factor among Korean women than men. Moreover, despite the decline prevalence of obesity and hypertension during the study period, as the inequality measured by education and income for the smoking, obesity, and central obesity and diabetes and hypertension increased among Korean women over 17 years. The overall finding of this study consistently showed health disparity according to SES indirectly indicated the need for social action to improve healthcare in people with low SES, limited access to the medical care system, and limited time for health behavior in people with low SES, resulting in poor metabolic parameter and eventually could increase the mortality risk of CVD. Considering the population-wide intervention, including tobacco and alcohol taxes, have effectively reduced the burden of common disease, we need more social intervention to reduce the burden of cardiometabolic disease from government and society, and to strengthen access to healthcare, particularly in low and middle income population. However, issue on health disparity, a global problem, and the current structure of health in terms of a public area is complex. So therefore, we need a national and interventional health policy program to improve health and to reduce the gap, health inequality, such as WHO Health Cities Project or Cities Changing Diabetes Project like this. After completion of our pilot study by mobile application to support the vulnerable patient with diabetes, we look forward to kind of IT-based approach for a patient with low SES being able to be extended and applied to other cities in the near future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. Now we heard from the four presenters all, and we want to give them a big thanks. Now I would like to invite our moderator, Professor Yoon, for the discussion session. Professor Yoon, please.
Thank you very much for very distinguished speakers. Now we had very informative and interesting talks from 4 different speakers with very interesting topic. If you have any questions in the audience or even in the speakers, if you have any question or comments, please join us to discuss about these topics. I would like to start first because many people are thinking about it. I would like to ask to the Dr. Napier. Very nice to see you again through the screen.
Nice to see you as well.
Okay. So I'm very impressive. Already 42 cities joined to the city changing diabetes program. Is very impressive. And you are some leader of our CCD program. So do you have any plan or some idea how we can make a synergy our CCD program in every other cities? Because every city has their own some project, a very interesting project, and make some progress even in this serious COVID pandemic. So you, as a leader of this program, you have to make some gathering some result and the plan for the future plan for the somehow making the synergy. Do you have any plan for that?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for asking me about this. First of all, it's a great pleasure to see you again, and to be in this really interesting program. I very much enjoyed all of the talks, and I was especially with respect to your question, I was especially interested to see how you've managed, even within the context of COVID-19, to produce such really interesting information. You'll appreciate the fact that with so many cities joining Cities Changing Diabetes, we are really challenged, as Professor Yoon Kang-ho has just said, with trying to actually develop among our global academic network relationships between cities and how we can share our learnings. And of course, historically, the way we've done this is through our summits, which of course we had to cancel the last one as COVID emerged in 2020. And we're unable to do what we typically do, which is to meet together collectively. But in the meantime, I only gave a few examples because of the limited amount of time that I had to speak. But in the meantime, what we've tried to do is we've tried to focus on what particular cities have brought to the conversation, and to do our best to publicize that at some level. And what if I could just say a few more words about what I felt today was, I was really very much impressed by the way in which your researchers have taken the question around the social determinants of health, and also indeed with Charlotte's presentation as well, to see how actions are taken around this, and for us to understand how incredibly important these things such as income, education, family background, and so forth, how incredibly important they are, and especially as Professor Kim pointed out in his talk, how we can quantify these relationships between poverty and obesity, and what actually the impacts of that are over time. So that's one thing that I want to emphasize, is that even with COVID-19, we're really trying to do our best to share our learnings and to actually work with each of our cities to develop new projects with them as well that meet their specific needs. But the other thing is that and I only mentioned this briefly in my talk, but the other thing is that we've found in our work that while the social determinants are incredibly significant, what's harder to measure are these sociocultural factors that keep emerging, things like trust and mistrust, and the importance of social isolation, which Charlotte Gloomer also referred to as being very important, and what kinds of actions that cities can take, whether it's focus groups or whether it's having opportunities for people to meet collectively, or as what we saw with Professor Kim, the creation of apps that actually help us to stay in touch with more vulnerable populations. But these are very hard things to quantify, and especially when we get to things like the question of human agency and people's abilities actually to adhere to what we know is going to help them live with their diabetes more successfully and avoid complications. And finally, I think that what we're learning and sharing is how important it is to think about health inclusion. What actually do we mean when we talk about the health sector? And this is where taking the Health in All Policies agenda, I think, is really important. We're looking at things like housing and water and sanitation and transportation and the occupational factors, the level, in addition of obviously levels of physical activity and the kinds of food that we're eating, but looking at all these things together and how these compounding stressors and risk factors create an increased vulnerability, and what we can do to move health beyond the hospital setting, beyond the doctor's office, and into communities where we can actually have a great impact. And I think indeed, as the evidence shows, we're able to do that, and we're really striving hard to bend the curve on diabetes. And I really look forward to the time when COVID-19 no longer prohibits us from meeting, and we can share our findings face to face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other the questions from some audience? Dr. Park from in the Busan, maybe join with us I heard your some voice when the starting the some Professor Kim's lecture. Do you have any question or comments on the lectures? He left. Did he left? Okay.
The Professor Parker left for another meeting.
Okay. Okay. And don't you have any question or comment in each the speakers?
Professor Yoon, I have question.
Okay.
Can I have the question?
Please, please.
Yeah, Professor Dr. Napier, thanks for your nice lecture. And I'm wondering that when we facing the COVID pandemic, I have some thoughts about the classic risk factors we know in kinds of the tobacco, alcohol, or some the sedentary lifestyle is still very firm factors to the cardiovascular disease or mortality, but many the lifestyle changes after the COVID-19 pandemic, because some people are have to the social distance, so social distancing. So actually, we analyzed our cities some glycemic control after social distance or lockdown. But very interestingly, there are variable results. Some people's more well controlled, but another people's are not controlled. So I think we have to find some factors to affecting some glycemic control in pandemic situation. So do you have any idea to new risk factors in these situations?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question. First of all, Professor Moon, I want to thank you for your really detailed presentation. It was absolutely fascinating, and I'm so glad this is being recorded because I want to listen to it again to dive deeper into the data that you present on the relationship between COVID-19 and diabetes and obesity. But thank you for asking me this. I think that one of the things that's become quite clear to us, and this of course has to do with social distancing, is how what we call the lived environment, that is to say, what the actual realities of what's the real world evidence around people's behaviors as it relates to social distancing, and how this actually has an impact on their behavior is just incredibly important. I mean, when you think about how we began thinking about vulnerability in COVID-19, of course, we thought about obesity and diabetes, immunosuppression, the elderly, but we weren't really thinking about, the fact that we couldn't have known then that 40% of COVID deaths in New York City, for example, are from care homes, and care homes are places where people share the same air, with smart buildings. We began to realize that, in fact, some of the most vulnerable people were people who lived in smart buildings who couldn't open windows, right? And that in fact, an elderly person living in suburban New York with a pension with a backyard to sit in was probably less vulnerable than someone on Park Avenue with a very high income who actually was unable to actually open the windows in their penthouse apartments. So what we're learning, I think, is that we have to really first of all, take the health and all policies agenda quite seriously and try to understand, as indeed I mentioned about our colleagues in Italy, to understand what do we know or don't know in any particular place around the health determinants in each of those sectors. And the second thing that I think is really emerging powerfully is the point you just alluded to, which is the mental health problem. We weren't really thinking a great deal about the strong impact that social distancing would have on mental health. And I think that this partially accounts for the variability in your data around people's management with respect to their ability to isolate. And I think there's a lot of work that really needs to be done here around the effect mental health, well, indeed the long-term effects of mental health as it relates to COVID-19, especially among young people. We could talk a lot about this, but just to give you one example, in Boston Children's Hospital, where they have a number of rooms for children who are considered to be at risk, either to themselves or to others, and need 24-hour surveillance and assistance from a provider. Now, they normally would have 3 or 4 children or adolescents in those rooms. Today, all the rooms are taken, and some people have to wait up to 11 or 12 days before they even get admission into the hospital. So the mental health, and this has been widely publicized, the mental health challenges are really quite significant. And I think we need to spend much, much more time on that. And indeed, that's one of the reasons I mentioned the Robert Wood Johnson policy brief, because in there is a specific section on the mental health challenges that are emerging from COVID-19. But thank you very much for this really important bringing up this very important topic. And again, I look forward to seeing your presentation again and to being in touch with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have one more question?
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I have one question to the Charlotte Grumman. Dr. Charlotte, you developed some very interesting web online education system. How do you advertise those kind of online system to the public, and how do you recruit some target population?
Thank you for the question. Actually, we are not recruiting the people into our center. They are only having these kind of sessions if they are referred to our center to have a patient education in diabetes or cardiovascular diseases. So we do not recruit them. We're trying to recruit people, though, in deprived areas, going out in the churches, being in the civil society as well as healthcare professionals. And so that's the way to recruit people who are vulnerable and with a low education and with another ethnic background. But for the virtual sessions, they are recruited inside the center.
Okay, thank you very much. Because the KDA, Korean Diabetes Association, also making some the YouTube education channel called 당뇨병의 정석. So we open to the whole public, and already 45,000 people was recruited as a visited to our YouTube channel, and they just read. However, we don't know about what's the effect of education to that kinds of patients. So we also thinking about how we can evaluate the efficacy of this kind of some education system.
Yes, and maybe I can comment on that, because we have also had other digital solutions going on in our center, but we closed it down because it was the wrong people on the digital solution. So I think it's really important to evaluate whether this decrease the social inequality in health, because the people who don't need so much, they can use your YouTube channel, but or do it increase the social inequality in health. That will be very important, I think, to evaluate.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Kim, in your research, we can find some very different the pattern in the male and female. According to the social economic inequality, cannot influence the same way in men and female. What's the important reason for the different kind of some response?
Yeah, so there is some kind of cultural difference in Korean the people. In male with high social economic status, they usually enjoy a lot of the meeting, the outdoor activity, and lots of dinner and the heavy alcohol drinking. So they kind of the various activity may negative impact on their lifestyle, even in the diabetic patient with high social economic status. But that was in women, that is a different story. In usually the diabetic women with high social economic status really focused on their the health itself. The more healthy diet and more exercise, and also think about their body shape.
Okay.
So as a result, there is some kind of difference in between men and women in Korean culture system.
That's interesting interpretation. I assume that already many research was underwent in some Western countries. What's the result in the Western country? They also had some kind of this difference, sexual difference, or they are very similar in each sex. How do you think, Dr. Kim?
I don't know exactly that, but that is my just the previous memory. There is no difference in terms of the disparity in both gender. It's a very similar pattern, but as I told previously, in the United States, the gap was widened during the study period.
Okay.
That means the regardless of their gender, the diabetic patient with high socioeconomic status, their usual the CVD risk factor showed the decreasing pattern compared to the diabetic patient with the low socioeconomic status, regardless of their gender.
Okay, that's great. So, any other questions from some speakers or audience? Okay, if you have any more questions, please very brief the statement for this kind of session. So if you have anything to say, please give some statement within 1 minute in each of the speakers. From Dr. Nephew, could you start?
I'm happy to, and I just want to say that it's been an immense pleasure being with you here today and learning about this really interesting research, and also more importantly is how we apply that research and turn it into action. And I'm really hopeful and eager, as Charlotte pointed out, that we are actually there are benefits to COVID, that we've learned some very new things. And the question is, I think, not to forget these lessons as we try to move back into what we would call a more normal way of living. And also, while we are still in the midst of the COVID challenge, to think about not just think about a just return to former times, but also to think about what the future might look like and what it might mean to prepare, to be more prepared in the future for how stress and social stress can actually exaggerate inequalities rather than leveling them, so that next time around, those who are socioeconomically more challenged, those for whom compounding risk factors make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to manage their diabetes and obesity, so that these people see that there are actually ways of coping, so that those people who are living on the margins don't, as we say in English, fall through the cracks. But thank you very much. It's really been wonderful, and I look forward very much to seeing everyone in person sometime soon.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Gruma, do you have some closing remark for us?
I will just say thank you for being at the meeting. I think we have to emphasize a lot of the social problems, relations in the population as well. And I was really impressed also on the Dang care study.
Yeah.
I would like to learn more about that, because we also work a lot with mental health and de-stress. So maybe when we meet again in real life, we can have some exchanges on how we do this really important work in our populations.
Okay, we will share with you. We will share with you if we can have some chance. Dr. Moon?
I would like to thank for all the audience and the speakers, and I learned a lot about the new lessons, and I want to say that the inequality in health is problem, but I'm concerning about the inequality in health budgets from government because this situation is very challenging, and the government want to use their budgets to the preventing the COVID-19 and the infectious disease. So I think I'm worrying about less budgets to the chronic disease like such as diabetes. But we learned that everything is connected. Diabetes is very closely connected with COVID-19 mortality and outcomes. So we have to claim and then we have to mention about the importance of the diabetes or another kind of the obesity, metabolic disease is very important in the COVID-19. So I think we have to stand firm together for the new era after post the COVID-19. Thank you for thank you. Yeah.
Great, Dr. Kim.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this meeting. This very valuable meeting. I learned lots of things from the wonderful speakers, and also thank you for the correct pronunciation, Dangdang the grammar. So the Dangdang care is characterized by various points, as you told, the psychological and physical support for the diabetic patient with low social economic status. But I'd like to also emphasize this program is a public-private partnership. In Korean medical system, we usually provide the medical care by individual clinic, that is the private base. So the approach and public management in community level is very important. So Korean Diabetes Association that have a strong willingness to join that kind of public the program. So after completion of Dangdang Care, we'd like to extend our program to other the community area, including Seoul City and whole Korean community area. Thank you for everything.
Not only for the Korea, we can extend 2 hours some experience to the whole world. Thank you very much for distinguished speakers. We got the very nice the spirit from your some talk. I think we realize today the COVID-19 pandemic and also the socio-economic inequality greatly impact on the diabetic people in our diabetic patients. So we have to deeply thinking about how we can overcome this kind of some inequality on the some health inequality on our patients. It's not only depends on the patient themselves. We have to thinking about what's the problem is, and we have to present this kind of research to the policymakers and the public too, and then we have to changing the city to improve our some the health inequality even in our some patients. Today is a very informative and valuable time for us, all of us, and I hope we have to make some very the close face-to-face meeting in the near future. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. This wraps up the discussions. And we're going to have the closing remarks. We're now seeing COVID-19 becoming even more serious as we're now, and there are
안녕하십니까. 서울특별시 시민건강국장 박유미입니다.
Hello, my name is Yumi Park, the Chief of Bureau of the Healthcare Policy. Thank you once again for the great seminar, for hosting the 2021 Cities Changing Diabetes and the related personnel. And thank you once again, Mr. David Napier, the Professor of Medical Anthropology at University College in London, Professor Moon Jun-sung, Ms. Charlotte Grumer, the Director of Center for Diabetes, and Professor Kim Shin-gon. And also, thanks to all of the audience for your participation today. Under the ever-changing COVID-19 situation, it is unfortunate that I was not able to participate in person. I hope that you will understand that I have shared a video. This inequality in the health system due to COVID-19 is emerging as a global problem. As COVID-19 is prevalent in various countries and classes around the world, various ethical controversies such as race or the gap between the rich and the poor are also emerging. To this end, thank you very much for the presentations on the health inequalities as well as the urban environment. Seoul metropolitan government is trying its utmost to overcome the COVID-19 as well as the inequality problems that is evident in the medical aspect. We will see to it that we are aggressive and proactive in overcoming these challenges. So I hope that the health experts, municipalities, as well as local governments will come up with various creative solutions to these problems. Thank you once again for your valuable time for us to reflect back on COVID-19 as well as diabetes. The discussions that we had today shall be implemented in the policies led by the Seoul metropolitan government. I hope that you will continue to stay safe and healthy during COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that remark. The materials and the presentations will be sent to the Seoul Metropolitan Government so that it can be reflected in the policy-making process. Now, last but not least, I would like to invite Ambassador of the Denmark Embassy in Korea, His Excellency Einar Jensen, please.
Thank you very much. Today we have had a very fruitful exchange of insights between Korea and Denmark, and a very important topic of diabetes and inequality has been discussed in quite a good level of detail, I would say. I think the topics has become of even greater importance, partly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has highlighted socioeconomic differences in our population. We saw some clear signs of being fairly well off or less well off and so on, and what that means in terms of dealing with diabetics. As mentioned several times today, it's evident that Korea and Denmark has many or share many of the same health-related challenges. Therefore, as close friends, I believe close collaboration is the right way forward and is beneficial for both parties in improving our respective healthcare systems. I also want to express my congratulations to Novo Nordisk and their partners for the very important work they do here in Korea. I look forward to the future collaboration and work to improve public health. Thank you to all who participated today in Korea, or from Denmark, or from UK. You've done a great job. You all deserve a big hand for your work here today. So thank you very much. 감사합니다, and a big hand to everybody.
Thank you very much to Professor David Napier, Professor Moon, Kim, and Ms. Charlotte Gloomer. Thank you all very much. And thank you everyone for staying with us for a long time. We want to give you a big shout out. Thank you all. Now this brings us to the end of the 2021 CCD webinar. Thank you all. Goodbye.